You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Why does it seem that conservatives love the rich and hate the poor? J.D. Foster of the Heritage Foundation is quite concerned that the Obama administration may be considering an increase on taxes on people making over $250,000 a year to help pay for health care for all Americans. Yet the rich have done better over the past 30 years than any other demographic group in America, and many economists argue the result of that has been the evisceration of the middle class, a new army of the working poor, and a health care crisis that no other industrialized democracy is seeing. We'll discuss what conservatives want and why they're so enamored with the very rich getting richer. J.D. Foster, the Norman B. Tour Senior Fellow of Economics in the Economics of Fiscal Policy, the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org, of course, the website. And J.D., welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Was
I unfair in my setup?
I wouldn't say unfair. I'd say more closely to absurd.
Okay.
Would be appropriate. Unfair is expected, I guess.
Well,
it's not that conservatives love the rich any more than liberals love the rich. And it's always farcical when I hear about conservatives who love the rich, and it's the liberals who have George Soros and their ilk providing all the money for their campaigns. It's not that we care about the rich. Frankly, I don't know any rich people myself. It's what we care about is that
they pay your paycheck.
Everybody else in the country have the opportunity to become rich and then subject to all the taxes you liberals love so much.
Yeah.
It's about the freedom and economic opportunity. And the simple fact is high taxes on small businesses, high taxes on big businesses, and the people who are producing, the people who are saving, really weaken the economy and weaken the ability for the economy to create new jobs and wealth. It's not about protecting the rich. It's about making sure everyone has an opportunity to get as far as their talents and abilities will take them.
Well, then let's look at this historically. It seems that, and Larry Beinhardt laid this out really well, large income tax cuts are almost always followed by bubbles and crashes. High income tax rates, particularly on the rich, always seem to correlate with economic growth and are followed by economic growth. And let me just give you a couple examples. During World War II, the top marginal tax rate was 73%, and not the highest, but pretty high. In 1922, a series of tax cuts began down to 56, 46, and finally in 1925, 25%. What happened? A boom, a bubble. The stock market took off, housing prices exploded, the boom turned into a bubble, and it crashed in 1929. And then from the mid-30s until the early 1980s, we had more than 50% tax on the very rich, and we had, for the first time in the literally since the founding of this country, we went more than 15 years without a bank panic, without a crash. We had steady growth of the middle class. And instead of like during the robber baron era, when owners and CEOs were making hundreds and in some cases thousands of times more than their employees, during that 50-year period, we had CEOs averaging about 30 times their employees. Reagan came in, dropped taxes on the rich back down below that 50% ceiling, and what did we have? As soon as that happened, virtually, we had another bank panic. We had the worst stock market crash since 1929 and 1987, and we've seen a series of bubbles a bubble and a boom and bust economy ever since. The one of the 90s, the one that's happening right now.
Well, I must say you're consistent with your absurdities, so let's stick with that. The idea that you're going to get a stronger economy by taxing productivity, by taxing the production of income, is absurd. It's like thinking you're going to go into a shower to get dry.
But it happened.
Work that way.
It happened.
It didn't happen.
The greatest period of industrial growth in the United States was from the 1950s to the 1980s, when we had top marginal tax rates of 74 to 91%, and corporations were paying 35 to 40% of total federal tax receipts. And now they're paying 7% of federal tax receipts. And
tax rates applied to almost nobody. And in any event, the high tax rates didn't cause the boom. You can't think that two things correlate just because they happen at the same time and there's causality. It just doesn't work that way. Many things are going on in the economy. When Reagan cut taxes, the economy boomed. We had a bubble later on. It was from the '86 Tax Reform Act. It wasn't due to the Reagan tax cuts.
The overall growth of the entire decade of the 80s was, what, 3.2%, 3.3%? The three previous decades had all been over 4%.
when you're absorbing excess resources that are in the economy, you're going to grow more rapidly. What we were growing at and got down to is full employment in this economy. That's what you're looking for, and that's what we got back again back in the 90s. We got back towards full employment. We got there not because Clinton raised tax rates. The tax increases that he put in place in 1993 ended up producing 4 slow years of growth. It wasn't until 1997 that we finally began to take off, having adjusted to the higher tax rates that Clinton put in place.
Well, those were only those were only slightly higher tax rates. I mean, that was nothing like jacking tax rates up to 70 to 90%. I would argue that monetary policy had far more to do with that. Reagan, with Greenspan driving interest rates down, creating the dot-com bubble, another bubble economy.
Yeah, Greenspan certainly had a bit to do with it, but the monetary policy did not drive the bubble economy until '99. At the end of the dot-com, he certainly did, for reasons specific to monetary policy. But it wasn't monetary policy that was driving the unemployment rate down in 1997 or 98. We had a fairly neutral monetary policy at that time.
It was still cheap money. I mean, Greenspan had been hands-off, cheap money, deregulation ever since the 80s, ever since the late 80s.
Yeah, Greenspan was definitely a free market guy. He recognized what happened in the 1990s. I'm not a Greenspan defender by any stretch, but he did get one thing right, and that was in the 1990s we saw a continuation of a productivity surge. And he recognized that and didn't clamp down on monetary policy artificially. That's what allowed us to get the unemployment rate down as low as he did, which was a good thing. That's something we're trying to do. He could have shut it down. He could have raised interest rates earlier and shut down that additional growth. It wouldn't have been a wise thing to do. It's one thing that Greenspan got right is he didn't shut down the Clinton boom.
Well, yeah, not if you want booms and booms and busts. We're talking with J.D. Foster of the Heritage Foundation, heritage.org. Why, sir, if tax policy doesn't play a role in this, was it that prior to the 1930s, during the robber baron era from the 1870s to the 1920s, you had the wealth of dynastic families, the Mellons, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Vanderbilts, on, and you had the equivalent of CEO salaries that were multiples in the hundreds to thousands versus the average worker. And during the 50-year period of high marginal taxation from the 1930s to the mid-1980s, you had the average CEO making about 30 times what the average worker made, and now we're back to more than 500 to 1 CEOs to workers. If that wasn't the result of tax policy, what is it the result of?
It's a result of many things, but it certainly was not the result of tax policy. Tax policy affects things at the margin. They do not drive overall conditions. They do not drive.
But this is the margin. This is the margin. No, this is the high end of income. That's the margin.
No, tax policy is affecting things at the margin throughout this period. The great many things were affecting the evolution of our economy. You had vast shifts in technology, enormous shifts away from an agricultural sector to an industrial sector. That wasn't driven by tax policy. That was driven by the shifts in technology. And
I'm not suggesting it was. I'm asking about the difference in CEO pay versus worker pay.
I think the CEO pay is a problem. I don't think it's
how do you address
it? Policy. Well, I think you have to go and find out what causes the CEO pay to be as high as it is. And this is one area where I fault conservatives and liberals. The CEO pay structure, the way we compensate CEOs, is a product primarily of a bunch of government rules that create a little club that CEOs live in and support one another, and the government rules basically wall them off from market
So you'd
pressure.
solve it with more deregulation?
I would solve it not so much by deregulation, but by finding the government rules that are insulating the CEOs from market processes.
Okay, well, on that point of possible agreement, let's even J.D. Foster, heritage.org. Thanks, J.D., for dropping by.